The courtroom smelled of cold coffee and hopelessness. Monique Ellison stood alone at the defendant's table, clutching a battered manila folder so tight her fingers ached. Her cheeks were wet. She hadn't even noticed when the tears started falling. She didn't come here today looking for sympathy, only a little fairness. But even that was slipping through her hands. "Your Honor," she said, her voice wobbling like a bridge about to snap. "I didn't miss court to disrespect you. My daughter. She had an asthma attack. We rushed her to the ER." Judge Perry Benedict barely looked up from his papers. He flipped a page slowly, as if her words were just background noise in his important morning. Then, finally, he glanced at her and smirked. "Smirked, Miss Ellison," he said, his tone dripping with contempt. "You people always seem to have a crisis right when it's time to face consequences." Laughter. Not loud, but sharp. A few snickers from the back row. Even the bailiff shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. Not even her public defender spoke up. Monique's lips parted, but no sound came out. The folder in her hand felt heavier than a stack of bricks. Inside it, her daughter's medical charts proof that her emergency was real pressed against her palm. But it didn't matter. Not here. The court finds the mother in violation of the prior custody agreement, Judge Benedict announced, tapping his pen on the bench like it was just another routine morning. Supervised visits are suspended. 6 months before review, a hammer to the chest would have hurt less. Monique looked around desperately, searching for a friendly face. Nothing. No one. Just a sea of strangers watching her humiliation unfold. The courtroom door creaked open. A man entered, not rushing, but walking with the calm certainty of someone who knew exactly where he was going. Navy blue suit, polished black shoes, a leather briefcase in one hand, a government badge clipped to his belt. The courtroom clerk noticed him first. Then the judge, Judge Benedict, blinked. His smirk faltered. The man took a seat in the second row without a word. He didn't have to say anything. His presence was louder than any outburst. Monique turned and saw him and froze. Julian. It had been 5 years. 5 years of silence after ugly words at their mother's funeral. 5 years of birthdays and Christmases and emergencies faced alone. And yet, there he was, her estranged brother, looking older, sharper, but somehow exactly the same. She could barely process it. She didn't even know how he knew. But she knew why he was here. Julian Prescott wasn't just her brother. He was an assistant U.S. attorney out of Washington, D.C. And he wasn't here for small talk. 3 nights ago, Monique had left him a voicemail, a desperate, raw message she never expected him to return. She'd replayed it a dozen times after hanging up, wondering if she sounded pathetic, wondering if it even mattered. Apparently, it did. Julian hadn't responded. He hadn't texted. He hadn't called. He had just showed up. The courtroom buzzed faintly as people gathered their things, ready to leave. Judge Benedict reached for his gavel to close the session. Julian stood up. "Excuse me, Your Honor." The room froze. Monique's heart lodged in her throat. Judge Benedict scowled. "And you are?" Julian walked down the aisle with measured steps, pulling out a leather ID holder. Julian Prescott, Assistant U.S. Attorney, Washington District. The gold seal glinted under the fluorescent lights. "This isn't a federal case." The judge snapped. Julian smiled slightly, the kind of smile that had made defense attorneys sweat in D.C. "Courtrooms?" "Not yet." He turned to Monique, voice gentler now. "Miss Ellison, may I represent you?" She stared at him, stunned, her voice trapped behind a wall of disbelief. Then finally, she whispered, "Yes." Julian faced the bench again, laying a neatly folded document on the clerk's desk. motioned to reopen custody review on grounds of procedural misconduct and absence of adequate legal representation, he said. Calm, crisp, unshakable, the judge's jaw twitched. Julian wasn't finished. I've reviewed prior transcripts. Your Honor, there's a documented pattern of denial without hearing, failure to notify counsel, and dismissive conduct toward unrepresented parties. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Judge Benedict leaned forward, trying to salvage control. You're skating dangerously close to contempt, Julian shrugged. And you're skating dangerously close to federal review. For a moment, neither man moved. Then Judge Benedict cleared his throat. Court will recess until 1:15. Julian gave a curt nod and turned to Monique. Come on, he said. You're not standing alone this time, and for the first time all morning, Monique Ellison felt like she could breathe again. The courthouse air felt different when Monique walked back in after lunch. No longer invisible, no longer the easy target. This time, she had a shadow behind her, and that shadow or a federal badge. Julian sat tall beside her, his navy blue suit still crisp despite the chaos of the morning. His presence alone shifted the balance. Lawyers whispered. The bailiff kept glancing over. Even Judge Benedict, who had spent the whole morning smug in his seat, now gripped his gavel with just a little too much tension. As court resumed, Julian rose first. Calm. Controlled. Your Honor, before we proceed, I move to admit new evidence regarding procedural irregularities in Miss Ellison's prior hearings. Benedict tried to brush it off, muttering something about wasting court time, but the room wasn't his anymore. Julian handed over a thick folder to the clerk. Inside were damning documents, missed notifications, records of meetings Monique was never told about, transcripts showing a pattern of bias. For the first time, Benedict faltered. He flipped through the pages, each one chipping away at the foundation he had leaned on for years, the assumption no one was watching closely enough to call him out. Julian didn't just attack the last hearing. He painted a picture of a system that had failed Monique every step of the way. No notification of hearing changes. No formal offers of counsel. No medical accommodation requests acknowledged. He paused, letting each failure sink into the wood-paneled walls. These aren't accidents. They're a pattern. And patterns leave trails. Monique sat still, her hands folded in her lap. Her heart raced, but she forced herself to breathe slow, steady breaths. She wasn't used to being defended. She wasn't used to anyone making noise on her behalf. Across the room, Gregory Harris, Layla's father, squirmed. His attorney leaned in, whispering fast. The deal they thought they had custody slipping quietly out of Monique's hands was unraveling in real time. Judge Benedict cleared his throat, his face reddening. Mr. Prescott, this court finds your tone highly inappropriate. Julian didn't flinch. Noted, Your Honor. But not illegal. A few people in the gallery smirked. The walls were thin in this courthouse. Word had already started to leak. People were paying attention now. Judge Benedict finally did what he'd avoided all morning. He recessed the hearing, gruffly declaring he would review the new materials thoroughly before making any further decisions. Translation. He needed time to figure out how to dig himself out, outside in the corridor. Monique leaned against the cool marble wall, eyes closed. Julian stood beside her, arms folded. You did good, he said quietly. I didn't do anything, she murmured. You showed up, he replied. That's more than most. A few hours later, news broke online. Toledo judge under scrutiny after attorney challenges custody hearing bias. The local paper posted a grainy photo of Julian handing over the motion to the clerk. Monique blurred in the background, clutching her folder like a shield. It didn't go viral. Not yet. But it moved. Quietly. Like a slow building storm. That night, Monique sat in her tiny apartment, Layla's drawings pinned to the fridge, an unopened carton of takeout beside her. She stared at her phone, thumb hovering over Julian's number. When she finally pressed call, it rang only once. "I'm proud of you," Julian said without waiting for hello, and for the first time in a long, long time, Monique allowed herself to believe it. She wasn't crazy. She wasn't weak. She had been treated unjustly, and now someone else saw it too. Across town, Judge Benedict paced the thick carpet of his office, phone in hand, sweat staining the back of his robe. His voicemail blinked. 4 messages from the chief judge, 2 from judicial conduct, 1 from a news station he couldn't ignore. The cracks were showing. He'd ruled this courtroom like a king for too long. But kings forget. Even a whisper from the right person at the right time can bring a kingdom crashing down, and this time, the whispers were getting louder. The next hearing came faster than anyone expected. Only 3 days had passed since Julian first challenged the court, but already the building buzzed with a nervous, charged energy. Something had shifted in Toledo's old courthouse, something invisible but impossible to ignore. When Monique and Julian walked back in, the courtroom wasn't half empty anymore. This time, journalists lined the last 2 rows. Not just the local paper, but regional outlets, reporters with press passes clipped to their shirts, cameras tucked discreetly under chairs. A new weight hung in the air. Not fear. Not yet. Accountability. Judge Benedict's face was tight as he took the bench. His robe looked heavier somehow, like he could feel every eye drilling into the small movements he used to make without thinking. He glanced at Julian, but this time he didn't smirk. He cleared his throat and spoke stiffly. "We are here to review the custody case of Ellison versus Harris, pursuant to newly submitted evidence and procedural concerns raised by the petitioner's counsel." Monique sat straighter. She could feel her own heartbeat hammering against her ribs, but she kept her hand still on her lap. She wasn't that woman anymore, the one crying at the defense table, hoping someone would notice. Julian rose. Calm. Relentless. "We respectfully request not only the immediate reinstatement of visitation rights," he said, voice carrying easily across the room, "but also an independent audit of previous custody rulings handled by this court." A gasp rippled through the gallery. Data and audit. In Toledo? It was practically unheard of. Judge Benedict fumbled, flipping through papers. "That is well outside the scope." "No," Julian cut in smoothly. "It is exactly within the scope when a pattern of bias impacts multiple cases, especially when that bias disproportionately affects defendants without legal representation." He let that hang there. Let it burn into the wooden walls. The judge opened his mouth, but before he could speak, the court clerk cleared her throat and passed him a sealed envelope. His face paled. "It was a formal notice. Judicial Review Board inquiry initiated. Effective immediately." The board wasn't waiting anymore. Judge Benedict's hand shook slightly as he set the envelope aside. "We will adjourn briefly," he muttered. 15 minutes, but everyone knew there would be no business as usual after today. In the hallway, Julian leaned against the wall beside Monique. "You're doing good," he said. She shook her head, a small smile tugging at her lips. "You're doing good. I'm just breathing. Sometimes that's enough," Julian said. "Sometimes breathing is the bravest thing you can do when a system tries to suffocate you." 15 minutes later, when they returned to the courtroom, a surprise awaited them. A senior judge, Judge Mary Ann Delacroix, now sat behind the bench, sharp eyes, calm hands, reputation for fairness. Benedict was gone. "Medical leave," the bailiff whispered, but the gallery knew better. Judge Delacroix reviewed the file quickly. She listened, truly listened, when Monique spoke, voice trembling but clear, about missing court to save her daughter's life. The judge didn't smirk. She nodded. She took notes. She treated Monique like she mattered, And then came the words Monique never thought she would hear, effective immediately. This court reinstates joint custody with a monitored transition plan. Ellison's parental rights are hereby restored. Pending final review in 6 months, Monique's breath caught. She turned to Julian, who gave the smallest nod. You earned this. It said, you fought for this, across the aisle. Gregory Harris's face twisted into a frown, but even he didn't protest. His lawyer quietly began packing up papers. The tide had turned not through rage, not through revenge, but through something far more powerful, truth. When they stepped out into the crisp Toledo afternoon, a small cluster of strangers stood waiting. Some clapped. Some simply nodded. Monique didn't know them, but it didn't matter. Sometimes the loudest victory isn't a parade. It's the quiet realization that you're no longer fighting alone. And somewhere deep inside the courthouse, behind closed doors and thick mahogany panels, the old system shifted uneasily, because once someone pulls back the curtain, once someone dares to call out what was meant to stay hidden, nothing is ever truly safe in the dark again. Some victories don't come with fireworks. They come quietly, stitched into the moments when people refuse to stay invisible. The headlines hit Toledo like a lightning strike. Federal attorney exposes courtroom misconduct. Local judge placed under investigation amid bias allegations. And beneath them, a photo. Monique Ellison, stepping out of the courthouse with her daughter Layla in one hand, Julian in the other. It wasn't just a local story anymore. Washington picked it up. New York. Even a few networks overseas, not because it was rare, but because it was so painfully common, a story people lived every day, but rarely saw brought into the light, inside the small hospital cafeteria where Monique worked part-time. Nurses huddled around their phones, scrolling through the news. Is that Monique? One whispered, I didn't even know she had a brother like that. Said another, she did. And now the whole city knew it too. Meanwhile, Judge Perry Benedict submitted his resignation in a terse 2-line statement, citing personal reasons. But everyone knew the truth. The Judicial Review Board's findings had been swift and brutal. Pattern of dismissive conduct toward self-represented defendants, multiple violations of procedural fairness, evidence of racially biased commentary caught on courtroom recordings. He had 2 choices: resign or face public disciplinary hearings that would rip apart whatever was left of his legacy. Monique didn't celebrate. There were no victory speeches, no champagne corks, just one quiet evening at home with Layla, watching cartoons, eating microwaved popcorn, and letting peace settle into the walls like warm sunlight after a long winter. Julian packed his bag the next morning, ready to head back to D.C. They stood on Monique's tiny porch, the morning chill in the air between them. You sure you'll be okay? He asked. She smiled, soft but certain. I think I was always okay. I just needed someone to remind me. He pulled her into a tight hug, feeling the years of anger, regret, and distance melt into something steadier, something real. Family. As he turned to leave, Layla came running down the steps, something crumpled in her little hand, a drawing. A stick figure of a woman standing tall in a courtroom, with a big red heart drawn around her, above it, in wobbly handwriting. My mom is the strongest. Julian blinked hard. He knelt, smoothing the paper gently. You're right. He said to Layla, You're absolutely right. The drive to the airport felt different this time. Lighter. He wasn't running away anymore. He wasn't burying the past under long hours and quiet regrets. And in the seat pocket of the plane, tucked behind the in-flight magazine, Julian slid the drawing inside, a reminder that sometimes justice doesn't look like courtroom victories or grand declarations. Sometimes it looks like a little girl hugging her mom tight after too many nights apart. Sometimes it's stitched into the small, stubborn moments when someone refuses to stay invisible. Weeks later, Julian received a letter on official stationery. The Department of Justice, inspired by the Toledo case, announced a new federal oversight initiative focused on small-town and rural judicial systems, data an entire branch of government, shifting not because of policy memos, not because of political pressure, but because one woman stood her ground, because one brother refused to let silence win, because a system that thrived on being unwatched had finally been forced into the light. Back in Toledo, Monique volunteered part-time at a legal aid clinic, helping single parents understand their rights. No law degree, no courtroom titles, just lived experience, and sometimes that mattered more. At the end of every week, when she picked up Layla from school, they'd walk home together, not fast, not rushing, just side by side, a mother and daughter, stitched back together not by the system, but by the simple, stubborn, extraordinary act of not giving up. Because justice isn't just what happens inside a courtroom. It's what happens when someone decides, you will see me, you will hear me, and I will not be broken. And when enough people make that decision, a city, a system, even a whole country, has no choice but to listen.